Today's Daf Yomi is Menachos Daf Lamates, Menachos 39. And we're going to start on the top of Lamates, Amar Aleph. The Gemara tells us on the top line, Amar Rabba or Rava Shema Mina Kesher Elyon Dioraisa. We know that the Kesher Elyon, the top knot, is biblical, is biblically required. There's a dispute amongst Rishonim. What does the top knot mean? Does it mean the knot closest to the garment? Or does it mean the knot farthest away from the garment, which is the top as relates to the pstil, relates to the fringes? So to be strict, we nowadays are the practice of doing both and make a double knot at the beginning and double knot at the end. But how do we know it's biblical? The Isal Kadai Tok Rabbanon, because if we're going to say it's rabbinic, my Itzrach Mishrei Sadim Betzitzis. Why do we need a special pasuk, a special limud, a special teaching to teach us that you can wear wool and linen together on your tzitzis? Shita would be obvious that it's allowed because a tokef tkifa achas eno chibor. Because if you just put them in together without a knot, that's not considered to be a connection which you're liable for shandes. So we see from here that it's a biblical requirement that the top knot is the biblical requirement. But Menachem Zemba said like this. He says, Kesher Elyon. What does it mean, the top knot? It means the Kesher. If you want to have a Kesher to the Elyon, to the Hashem above, Dioraisa. That comes through the Torah. That comes through the studying of Torah. That's going to give us the greatest Kesher to Hashem Yisparach. Amar Rav bar Avada, Vaiter in the Gemara, Amar Avada, Amar Rav. Im nifsa kachut meikaro. If, let's say, the string tore off from the garment, from the source, psul, it's disqualified. Well, obviously it should be disqualified because there's no tzitzis. So some say, even if the Karanor says, even if only one of the strings fell off, then we're going to say it's disqualified. Yosef, Rav Nachman, we know that, let me just take a step back. When you make the tzitzis, you put 4 strings, which you fold over. So if even one on each corner, so that's 8. So if even one of those fell off, that's going to be disqualified. So he repeated it. When do we say that it's disqualified? So if when you make the tzitzis, it's not connected. But after a while, then shirav the garduma of kolshu. But the sofo, in the end, as long as its stubs or its remnants are still there, we say it a little bit amount, it's going to be kosher. Kosher. My shirav magermud. Then what does that statement mean? My love doesn't mean shirav de ifsak minayo, vishtar minayo, that shirayim means that it broke off and it's still on the on the chulia, so it broke off from the source, but it's still on the little section, and so it's kosher. And moved of the gardum gardume, and our gardumov is where it's a stub. But we see from here that the shirayav is where it broke off from the source. It's still kosher. So that means when we say it's disqualified, that's only at the beginning, but not at the end. Gemara says, no, that's not what it means. Chada katani. No, we read that statement as one statement. Shiurei garduma of kolshu. As long as you have a little bit of the remnants of the stubs, then we're going to say it is kosher. If that will be the case, lema garduma. You should just say garduma. Shirayav lamali. Why does it have to say the shirayav? So Gemara says, no. Hakamashman is teaching us the ba'inan. That it's teaching us the following. What's it teaching us? The ba'inan shiura garduma. You need at least, if in order for the gardumah to be kosher, the stubs to be kosher, you need a specific amount. And what is that amount? As we said in yesterday's daf, kadela anvan, in order to tie them into a knot. Yosef Rabba the Kamar Mishmei de Rab. So Rabba was sitting and he said in the name of Rab, Chut shal kerach ola min minyan. So as we said, that you have to have 4 strings, and the practice is that one of those strings is the longer string, that's called the shamish. And that wraps around. So this thread that you wrap around, that counts as part of the minyan. We'll see later on in the daf that you have to wrap them a certain amount of time. I mean, maybe 3, maybe 7, maybe 13, up to 13. So the wrapping of the kerach, that counts, the chut shel kerach, the one that does the wrapping, that counts as part of the number of strings that you need to have. So Amar Rav Yosef, Shmuel Amra. So Rav Yosef said, this, first of all, he says it wasn't Rav who said this, it was Shmuel who said this. Shmuel was the one who taught this. Shmuel Amar V'lo Rav. Itmar Nami Amar Rav Bar Chana Sachli Rabbi Yoshai Demin Usha Chut Shel Kerach O Min Minyan. That the string that wraps around the other strings, that is counted as part of the count. Yasiv Rabba or Rava, depending on the gersa. The Ka'amar Mishmei de Shmuel. Tcheles Shekarach Ruba Kshera. Here the tcheles doesn't mean specifically the wool, it means the part of the Gedilim. So let's say you have the parts that you wrap around, and now it takes up most of the strings. Mean to say there's two parts. There's the gadil and there's the pasil. The gadil is the part that's braided, and the pasil is the stuff that hangs down, the strings that hangs down. So we're going to see in a few moments that it's ideally supposed to be 1/3 braided, 2/3 hanging down. But let's say you did the braiding part, that it was the majority, it's still kshera. I'm going to say Rav Amrav Shmuel. So he said Rav said it's not Shmuel. Nimar Nami Amrav Huna Bar Yehuda Amrav Sheshes Amir Rabbi Yirmei Bar Abba Amrav Tchela Shekarach Ruba Kishera. That we learned the statement name of Rav. The Tchelas that the majority of it was wrapped around this kosher. Rav Chia Bered Rav Nasan Masni Hachi. Avoker Tov. Good morning, Jeff. So Rav Chia Bered Rav Nasan Masni Hachi. Amar Rav Huna. He taught like this. We're in the bottom of Lamates. I'm off that Rav Huna taught Amar Rav Sheshes Amar Rav Yirmi Barabba Amar Rav Tchela Shekarach Ruba Kshera, that if the wrapping around part of the tzitzis is the majority of the strings, it's kosher. Va'afilu karach ba elachulya achas kshera. And even if, and now we say that va'afilu karach ba elachulya achas, meaning to say, even if you only wrapped it around for one chulya. Each chulya, Rashi says, is a minimum of a cuff of a circuit of 3 times. So he said that if you did the wraps around or the braiding or the chulios, if you did that 3 times, that's okay. If you did that the majority, that's okay. If you did it also just the distinct minority, that it was only 1 time, that's also kshera. But what's the proper way to do it? V'noye tchelas, the most beautiful way to make the v'noye tchelas, the most beautiful way to make the tzitzis is shlish gadil, is 1/3 of the strings should be braided or wrapped around with the knots and the wraps. Ushnei shlishei anaf, and 2/3. Do you have the place, Jeff? Bottom of 39a, and 2/3 of it should be the strings hanging down. The kama shiur chulya. How much is the space of this chulya? How much is the space? How much should take up the time, or what's the measurement of the chulya? Again, the chulya is the part where it wraps around with the knot. We say you have to have a knot at the end of each one. How much should that be? How many circuits of the string of the shamish around the other strings? So Tanya Rabbi Omer Kadesha Yichroch v'Yishne v'Yishlash. So it has to be 3 times. To wrap it around once, twice, and a 3rd time. So Tana hapoches lo yifos mishiva v'amosif lo yosif al shloshes. Right? No, we learned that you have to do you can't do less than 7, and you can't do more than 13. You can't do less than 7 wraps and more than 13. Hapoches lo yifos mishiva. That you can't do less than 7 circuits with the string. Kineged shiva rakiyim. This corresponds to the 7 heavens. We have 7 heavens. Where do we know this concept of 7 heavens? Where do we see this concept of 7 heavens from? So this is the Gemara Chagiga. The Gemara Chagiga names the 7 heavens. Anybody remember the names? The names are Vilon, Rakia, Shechakim, Zavul, Mahon, Machon, Aravos. And each one has a different function. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, there in the Gemara, there's only 2 Rakim. There's only 2 heavens. Okay, fine. So we're following Reish Lakish, who says that there are 7 heavens in our tzitzis. V'amosef or Yosef al Shloshes, right? You're not allowed to add to 13. Kineged Shiva Rakian. This corresponds to the 7 heavens. V'shisha Aviran Shebenim, and the 6 spaces in between them. And Rashi says, Val Shem, why do we do this? Why do we care about we're doing tzitzis? Why do we put the heavens there? Rashi says, Aval Shem Shatchelas Domeliam, because the Tchelas on the tzitzis is similar to the sea, and the sea is similar to the heaven, like we're going to say on the Gimel on the base. And therefore, we look at it, we're going to remember the heavens, because the tchelos reminds us of the heavens, and so therefore it's that reminder. Um, that's what Rashi says. Now, in addition to that, Tosfos here on the left side of the page says, "Masha anu noagim chamisha ksharim." We have 5 knots, so we have 8 strings, and we have 5 knots. So each time we do the between the 7 and the 13 wraps, we have 5 knots. Where do we get the 5 knots from? So because the gematria of tzitzis is 600. And so therefore when we get the 8 strings and the 5 knots, that gets us to 613. Joseph points out, yeah, that's only if you spell tzitzis in a manner in which it's not spelled in the Torah, does it make the gematria of 600. So then they deal with that also. Okay, so now we're up to the next piece of the Gemara. Tana kashu matchil ba'ulav. And when he begins to do the wrapping, he wraps with the white one. And then in the middle, he starts wrapping with the blue one, and then he goes back and finishes with the white one. That's how Rashi reads this Gemara. And why do we say that? Hakanaf min kanaf, because you have to start from the same type as the garment. The garment is typically speaking the white, which is the lavan. Ukashum Messiah, and when he concludes it, Messiah b'lavan, he's supposed to conclude it with the white one. Why? Malam b'kodesh re'emuridin, because we want to go up in holiness and we don't want to go down. And since the pasuk put the min kanaf, the white one first, so we see that that's chashav. So therefore, if you conclude with the tcheles, you're going down in holiness. And therefore, that's why you're supposed to conclude with the white. Rav bar Barchana v'Yasvi have a kachof v'azo ahu gavra. So Rav and Rav bar Barchana were sitting there, and a person was passing by there. The michse guima dechua tchelta. He was wearing a garment which was entirely made out of techeles. That's okay. V'ramile tchelta, and he put on the tzitzis on it, the tcheles, ugedila migdal, and all the tzitzis were braided together on top of lametesim and bays, and he didn't have any strings. Everything was braided. So I'm a Rav. Yai glima has a beautiful coat, yai tchelta, but he doesn't do the tzitzis properly. It's because he only did it b'di'evah because he's supposed to have the strings. And Rabbi Barchana Amar Yai Glima v'Yai Tchelta. He says he has a beautiful garment and his tchelos is also beautiful. But my commitment, the Rabbi Barchana Savar Ksiv Gedil, Ksiv Pesil, means it says braided or it says the strings. Oh Gedil, oh Pesil. Yeah, I could do one or the other. You don't need both. But Rabbi Savar no. Oh and Pesil, but you need the strings hanging down. Who Gedilim, who. And when it says Gedilim in the Torah, that's to teach us the number of strings, meaning to say Gedil Shem Gedilim Asay Gedil, make it a braid uposlayo mitocho, make the strings coming down from it. We know that it is a concept of making a beautiful talus. That's the concept of Zekeh Livanvel. You're supposed to try to make a beautiful talus for yourself. I have Baruch Hashem, I have a beautiful talus coming in the mail. It should be here either today, tomorrow. You'll see I have a new talus coming, which hopefully people will like. Amr Shmuel Mishmei Delevi Chutei Tzemer. So now we're going to go into the material that was supposed to be worn, that tzitzis was supposed to be made out of. So it says Shmuel in the name of Levi Chutei Tzemer. Let's say you have the strings that are made out of wool. Potrin b'shal pishtan. That will exempt a talus that's made out of linen. Normally, we say that the talus is supposed to be that you're not allowed to wear shatnez, but by tzitzis there's a special dispensation. So if the strings are made out of wool, you can exempt a garment made out of pishtan, which is linen, which typically speaking is shatnez, but that works those strings. So the Gemara let's analyze this more. Ibayu shel pishtan. Let's say the garment is made out of linen. Mao shayipatru b'shal tzemer. Okay, let's say you reverse it. Let's say the garment is wool and the strings are linen. Can that also work? Do we say tzemer b'shal pishtim mudapater, that the wool strings exempt the linen garment to even or not exempt, to fulfill the requirement for the linen garment to even the tchelas patra nami patra. So since we want to say that since since it will exempt a garment that's wool, so do we say shall pishtim maush? Do we say tzemer bepishtim hu depater the kivan detchelas? Because since the it's wool patra, so since the woolen strings will exempt the linen garment, lavan nami pater. So therefore, the white strings will also exempt since the woolen strings will exempt the linen garment, the white strings will also exempt the woolen garment. Excuse me, lavan nami pater. That also, just like blue strings exempt the linen garment, also white woolen strings will exempt the linen garment. Aval pishtim b'tzemer. But if it will be linen strings, they will not exempt or fulfill the obligation of a woolen garment, and that you can't do. Oh, Delma, or do we say, Kivin since it says in the Pasuk, you can't wear wool, Tzemer Pishtim Yachtav, can't wear wool and linen together. Gedilim Ta'aselach, but you can do it to make the tzitzis. Loshna Tzemer Pishtim, Loshna Pishtim and Tzemer. Or do we say it doesn't matter, and you can use linen strings for a woolen garment? So that's the Gemara's question. Tashma, how do we answer this question? The Amar Rachba taught, Amar of Yehuda. What does he teach us? Chutei tzemer, potrin, bishel. So what does Rachba teach us in the name of Rabbi Yehuda? Chutei tzemer, potrin, bishel pishtan, potrin, bishel tzemer. So he says, strings of wool will fulfill obligation if it's a linen garment, and if it's a linen strings, it will fulfill the obligation if it's a woolen garment. Chutei tzemer pishtim. So that's the implication of the statement of the Brisa, which tells us Chutei tzemer potrin b'shal pishtin potrin b'shal tzemer. Chutei tzemer pishtin potrin b'kol makom. But wool and linen garments will always fulfill. Vafilu b'shirayin, and even if it's a silk garment. So we see from here that you can use linen strings to fulfill the obligation for a woolen garment. Pligi the Rav Nachman. And this argues with Rav Nachman, the Amar of Nachman. Hashirayim peturim min hatzitzis. Rav Nachman says the silk garments are exempt from tzitzis because it's not the wool or linen, so therefore it's exempt from tzitzis. Hashirayim peturim min hatzitzis. So Eisvei Rabbo Rav Nachman, you're saying that if it's not wool and linen, it doesn't require tzitzis. Eisvei Rav Nachman, Hashirayin. What about the fact that Hashirayin v'aklach v'asrikin? These are different types of material, maybe silk or klach is that Rashi says something you make from I don't know, like a type of fish. I don't know, or maybe that's not what Rashi means, but that's I don't know, some aquatic creature, they make the garment. It says explicitly that they are required in tzitzis. So how would Rav Nachman, who says they're not, explain that? So Rav Nachman says, no, that statement means midrabanan. Rabbinically, we put the tzitzis on garments. They're not wool or linen, but biblically speaking, they're not required. Well, what about the next clause? The kulan semro pishtim potrim bahan. It says specifically wool and linen will exempt everything. Now, so if you want to say it's biblically required, that's why you're allowed to put wool and linen together to exempt the garment. Eliamris to Rabbanan, if you say it's only rabbinically required, these garments, well then how could you put wool and linen on something that's only a rabbinic requirement? Eliamris Rabbanan, how can you put the wool and linen together? Says, no, it means ema ot semer o pishim. You could either use wool or linen, and hachinami mistaber. Neither that's logical. The katani seifa, because the next clause says hein b'minon potrin shelo b'minon ein potrin. The wool and linen, if it is their same substance, it exempts him, and if it's shelo b'minon, if it's not the same substance, the silk types of garments that if you put them on their own if you put the silk strings on a silk garment, exempts them. But if it puts it on a woolen garment, then ain potrin. Now, if you want to say that they're only biblically obligated, if they say they're only rabbinically obligated, that's why you can exempt them with a with not wool or linen. Now, if you want to say that biblically required to put strings on the silk tzitzis, well, tzemer pishtimu de pater. The only thing that works in the Torah is wool and linen. You can't use silk strings to exempt your tzitzis. So the Gemara says, no, that's no proof. Kid Rava. We could explain that Gemara like Rava. The Rava, Ramiksiv, Rava threw two psukim against each other. One pasuk says hakanaf, which means min kanaf. It says in the pasuk that you have to put on the tzitzita kanaf, which means you have to put on this from the same material as the garment. Uksiv tsemru pishtim yachtav, and it says Tamar Pishtim, Haketzad, Tamar Pishtim, Potrim, Be Baminan, Be Vishalo Baminan, Sha'ar, Minan, Baminan Potrim, Shalo Baminan, Aim Potrim. No, so what Rava is saying, it means that if it would be wool and linen, then it could exempt everything. But if it's not wool and linen, then the only strings you can use are the same material. So again, we have a fundamental dispute. So according to Rava, biblically, everything is required to wear tzitzis. According to Rav Nachman, only wool and linen garments are obligated to have the tzitzis. It's a fundamental dispute. The Rav Nachman, who says that only wool and linen, he would say that the Tana of Shmuel, Tana of Shmuel, Hol v'nemru begadim b'Torah stam. Since the Torah says that the begadim, the garments, it mentions that just like basically without specifying a specific type of garment. It says and then the Torah says one time specifically the garment is made out of wool and linen. So we say af kol tzemer pishim. Anytime the Torah mentions a garment, it means only wool or linen. Amar Abai v'haitan be'rishmo ma'afka v'haitan be'rishmo ma'afka mi'idach tan be'rishmo. So the Abai says this time very small. We have a different teaching who learns it out this teaching, and he argues with it. The time very small. Beged Ainli Ella Beged Semer Minayo Rabos Semer Gemolim Semer Navim No Tishalizim. How do we know when it says Beged? It means all different types of wool, and also Klach Strikim Mishirayin Tamalomar Beged, meaning to say that when it says beged in the Torah, it means all garments. So basically, according to Rava, when it says the beged in the Torah, it means any garment requires tzitzis. According to Rav Nachman, only a wool or linen garment. So now the question is, how do we rule? So according to Rav Nachman, really, you should only wear tzitzis that are woolen. And that's the biblical requirement. And so that's the best way to do the mitzvah. So that's why many are strict that they only wear woolen talis and a woolen talis cotton, woolen tzitzis, because that's the best way to do it. But the Ashkenazim are, according to the Ramah, you don't have to be strict, and because we could pass like Rava and say that any garment that's even if it's not specifically woolen, even if it's cotton, requires tzitzis. And so therefore, that's why many Ashkenazim are lenient like that. But Rav Moshe supposedly said that you should try to wear a woolen garment. Say the Vilna Gaon used to wear a cotton garment. People say, no, maybe he didn't. That's because he was always wearing the talis, which was woolen. Anyway, if a person could be strict to wear a woolen garment, then he'll fulfill the mitzvah according to all the positions. Of course, once you start doing that, other things you should be strict upon in general also. Anyway, so this is today's daf, and Baruch Hashem, we'll review it in a little bit at 8 o'clock.
Thank you.